Now for me, I always hated the idea of walking around and doing street photography or traveling with a large camera or a big DSLR strapped around my neck. Not many camera brands make cameras and lenses which focus on being both small and light. This is why I was drawn to Fujifilm in the first place. The balance between the image quality and portability, as well as the retro look of the cameras, always encouraged me to get out there and shoot, even on days where I wasn't specifically leaving the house to take photos. And I'm sure in time this has actually made me a better photographer, because the camera itself has encouraged me to get out there and shoot more. So maybe you've already got a Fujifilm camera, or you picked up a Fujifilm over the winter, or were gifted one. In this video, I'm gonna just go through a couple of tips so you can get the most and the best out of your camera. So first up, and this is one especially helpful to beginners, but I actually still use it for pretty much all of my street photography, but it's to use the auto ISO settings in your Fujifilm camera. Now, what I tend to do is, on the top dial, I always turn my ISO and shutter speed to auto, and then in the menu system, I set my max ISO and minimum shutter speed. Now what this means is, when you go out to shoot and do street photography, you can be fully focused on what's going on around you and not really worrying about what's going on the camera. Now to be honest, the cameras these days, especially the newer Fujifilms, they do a great job at reading the scene and setting the settings. Now that said, there are going to be times where you will want to go into manual mode. There's certain circumstances, certain weather settings and such. So you probably in the long run should know and learn how to use your camera in manual mode completely. But when you're starting out, there's absolutely no problem with sticking some of these settings on auto and letting the camera do the work. Now there's some photographers out there who will try to tell you that in order to be a proper photographer, a proper street photographer, that you must learn to shoot manual and you must always shoot manual. In my opinion, that is completely untrue. I know many professional street photographers who don't shoot manual. But as I said earlier, there are times where you will want to go manual. If you want to take a creative long exposure shot, then you want to move that shutter speed down. There's no way the camera's auto settings are going to do that for you. And that's just one example. There's many circumstances and many weather conditions and stuff like that where you will want to go manual. So just keep that in mind. When you're starting out, go auto, there's absolutely no problem with it, but do learn manual in the long run. But even for street photography, 9 times out of 10, I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. That means my shutter speed's on auto and my ISO is on auto, and I let my camera handle that. As for the settings I use for the auto ISO, Fujifilm allows you to save 3 different presets. For daytime, I set a minimum shutter speed of 200th of a second, and I do the max ISO at 1600. And then in the evening, I switch the max ISO to 3200 and I bring my shutter speed down to a 60th. And what I also do there is I move my camera into burst mode. So when shooting at night time, I kind of get away with shooting at a lower shutter speed by just taking more frames in that short amount of time. So this may be another one for beginners, but it's often a setting I use myself on a regular basis while doing street photography, and it's to use the zone autofocus mode. So Fujifilm actually have a couple of different autofocus modes. First up, there's wide/tracking. There's also single point. This is another good setting for street photography. So finally, there's zone autofocus mode. And this is the one I use most when I'm doing street photography. The reason I don't use single point is sometimes if you focus on a point, say on the left side of your frame, and then something quickly happens on the right hand side, it can take a long time to move that little dot across the screen to exactly where you want it to be. With the zone, you can control how big it is, and it's much easier, much faster to move straight across the frame. Finally, when it comes to autofocusing with these Fujifilm cameras, I tend to turn the face detect off when doing street photography. And I find that this setting sometimes overrides where I want to focus and what I want to focus on, and instead will focus on a face even if I don't want to. So do keep that in mind if you're out doing street photography. It can be a bit annoying sometimes when the camera just switches on to people's faces, even when you want to, for example, focus on the background or something in the distance, and then have the people in the foreground to be out of focus. So third up on the list is to use the exposure compensation dial to underexpose your images. Now 9 times out of 10 when I'm doing street photography, I'm always underexposing. And the main reason for this is these Fujifilm cameras seem to do a really good job at preserving details in shadows. Now with digital photography in general, digital sensors don't do as good a job at preserving details in highlights as they do in shadows. So what that means is if you shoot and your highlights are blown out, or you're shooting on a bright day and you can see the sun in the corner and that part of the image is blown out, it's very hard to bring details back from that part of the image. Whereas if you take a shot and there's loads of shadowy areas and it looks really dark, you can still go into Lightroom and bring all those details out of the shadows and they don't look degraded or they don't look noisy or anything like that. As I said, these sensors do a really good job at preserving those details in the shadows. This is especially helpful at nighttime. Now when you're doing street photography at nighttime, what often can happen is things like street lights or the lights coming out of shop fronts can easily get overblown. And when that happens, it's very difficult in Lightroom or any editing software to bring the details back out of those lights. And the same goes for if there's a light on somebody's face. If that's blown out, again, it's very difficult to bring the details back in the face. Whereas when you're shooting at nighttime, you can use your exposure compensation dial to preserve the highlights. And while the shot will look very dark when you're taking it, as I said earlier, when you get into Lightroom or any editing software, you can bring the detail straight out of the shadows and then you can still edit the highlights as well. So next up, and this only really applies to those of you using Lightroom to edit your Fujifilm images, but it's to use the enhanced image feature in Lightroom on your Fujifilm files. Now for some reason, because these Fujifilm cameras use an X-Trans sensor, Lightroom finds it very difficult or has trouble sharpening the images and rendering them. And what that means is when you sharpen these images, sometimes you get these worm looking artifacts in the photo and they look pretty ugly. It's not such a big problem when it comes to just posting images to social media where they're going to be viewed on small screens. But when it comes to printing images taken on Fujifilm cameras, then that worming artifact can become a big problem. So when you go into Lightroom and you use this setting, what it will do is it will create a new file and it will be a DNG file. And when you sharpen this version of the image, you won't get the same worming artifacting going on. So that kind of solves that problem. Otherwise, you can use different editing software. Capture One does work a lot better with Fujifilm files. I'm pretty sure Fujifilm themselves helped make all their work with Capture One when they created their software. So the final tip I'm going to give you is to master the quick buttons at the back of your camera and edit them around your photography style. So in my case, when I'm doing street photography, I need the key features and settings to be easily accessible so I can focus on what's going on around me and not going into menu systems on my Fujifilm camera. So first up, on the front here, I have a button set to switch between mechanical and electric shutter. There are times where I don't want the electronic shutter going off, if I'm doing events or if I'm on underground or if I'm on public transport, something like that. Sometimes using the electronic shutter is a lot better because it is silent. So next up, I also have a button mapped to drive mode where I switch between still image and continuous. I also have a hotkey for autofocus mode where I go between single point and zone. And finally, I also have ISO auto settings mapped to the hotkey as well. So here I have Auto 1 and Auto 2, which I use most of the time. And I talked about this earlier, where one of them is set for the daytime and one of them is set for the evening. Other than that, I also have hotkeys mapped to photometry and exposure lock. Finally, when it comes to customizing these buttons at the back of your Fujifilm camera, you really have to master them and remember exactly where everything is off the top of your head. Think about it a bit like when you're playing a PlayStation or an Xbox game. You don't actually think consciously about where each button is or which button you're pressing. When you really get good at the game, it just happens automatically and you know exactly where everything is. And it's got to be exactly the same when you're out taking photos, because the last thing you want to happen is when you're out shooting, you don't want to kind of forget where one of the buttons is or one of the settings is, and then you end up missing the shot or messing up the shot. So really just master your camera, the setup, the buttons. If you have multiple Fujifilm cameras, try and set them up as close to each other as possible, when you get a new Fujifilm camera, set it up in the same way as you have in your old camera. And that way, when you're out shooting, you don't have to think too much and you can kind of just focus on what's going on around you and the scene and just capturing the good shots rather than thinking about which buttons where and where the setting is for autofocusing or whatever it is. I hope some of the tips in this video have helped you. If you have any tips of your own, please do drop them down in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please remember to subscribe. A huge thanks for watching this. I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll catch you in the next one.